Welcome to Emerging Leaders, where we discover leaders of today who are driving change for a better tomorrow. My name is Toby Lee, and today we will be speaking to Giulia Gasparri, a young professional in international relations and environmental policy. Giulia actively participates in global health and national youth climate networks, including the Youth Climate and Health Network hosted by the Global Climate and Health Alliance. Currently, she holds the position of Project Officer at the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, or PMNCH, also known as the world's largest network dedicated to promoting health and well-being of women, children, and adolescents. Welcome, Giulia. And to start off our show, can you please tell us about PMNCH and your leadership role at this organization?
Thank you, Toby. It's an honor to be here today to share a bit about my experience, and thank you so much for inviting me. So, as you mentioned, I'm working as a project officer at PMNCH, the world's largest alliance committed to promoting women, children, and adolescent health. We are an alliance which brings together partners, and currently we have over 1,400 member organizations divided into different constituency groups. So, from governments, private sector, businesses, healthcare professionals, youth led organizations, NGOs, academia, you name it, to really come together in a platform for better advocacy and accountability for women, children, and adolescent health. Our vision is really to for a world where every woman, every child, and every adolescent realizes their rights to health and well-being, leaving no one behind. And so our mission is really to mobilize and align and amplify voices of partners to advocate for the health and well-being of women, children, and adolescents, really to ensure that partners can come together and do more together than what they can do alone. In my role specifically, I'm working as a focal point on climate change, and I'm looking specifically at the interlinkages between the climate crisis and women, children, and adolescent health, looking at how climate change is really impacting the health of women, children, and adolescents, specifically also looking at our political advocacy. So, what can we do about it? What can we do to actually make the change? And the last thing I wanted to mention is currently at PMNCH, we have launched the 1.8 billion Young People for Change campaign, which is something that I'm also involved in. And the purpose of the campaign is really to rally commitments for adolescent well-being in terms of policies, more policies, more financing, and more services dedicated to this population group. And this is in the lead up to the Global Forum for Adolescents, which will be a global main stage, which will happen on the 11th and 12th of October, and at a virtual level. And then it will be pegged to national events at the country level. And currently, we have a What Young People Want campaign as well, in which young people are really contributing to say what are their priorities, what are their needs. And we are happy to have reached 1 million inputs from young people. So 1 million young people have actually raised their voice and said what they need. And it's actually very striking because the results say that the majority are asking for more education and more skills for employment. So this is one of the emerging number one priorities in terms of the asks on adolescent well-being that we're working on as a partnership.
Giulia, wonderful. Set the stage for me as a professional, in the field of climate change. What are the current issues that, keep you up at night? What are the emerging issues in climate change that you think that people need to act now?
Thank you, Toby. So, the issue of climate change, I think nowadays we see it quite frequently in the news, finally, I would say. And people around the world are really starting to understand what are the impacts of climate change and specifically the impacts in their daily lives, because the increase in extreme weather events over the past years has been incredible and quite scary. And honestly, this is what keeps me up at night. And this year, only this year, it actually has been the World Meteorological Organization has declared that July 2023 was the hottest 3-week period ever recorded. And it had the 3 hottest days also ever recorded, and the sea ice was the lowest on record. And this is why actually in July, the UN Secretary General has announced that we're not in the era of global warming anymore, we're in the era of global boiling. So I think the main issue, like the issues which are being raised currently in the climate change arena, I think, are several. One is that current progress is very inadequate and that we are not on track to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in December 2015, the countries around the world came together through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they agreed on the landmark resolution of the Paris Agreement. And there they agreed to limit the warming of the planet to ideally 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, and ideally below 2 degrees. And the current United Nations Environmental Program emission gap report shows that in reality we're not on track to reach that goal by the end of the century. The window to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming is rapidly closing, and the progress is inadequate, and we're actually on track for a 2.8 degrees Celsius warming. So that is significantly over the targets that countries have agreed through the Paris Agreement. So that is the first issue. We're not on track to reach our goals. The second is that, and as I mentioned, we are starting really to see the devastation that climate change in terms of increase in extreme weather events is having across the whole world. So climate change does not impact everyone in the same way. And this is very much linked to the issue of climate justice. People who are in hotspots of vulnerabilities, such as small island developing states, already humanitarian and fragile settings, low and middle income countries. These are the regions of the world that are hit most by climate change, extreme weather events such as droughts, storms, floods. And at the same time, even within these countries and in general across the world within countries, those who are already vulnerable and already face discriminations because of their gender, age, ethnicity, low income will also be impacted the most. So, and this is an issue of climate justice, essentially. These vulnerabilities are caused by historical patterns of inequality that will only be exacerbated by climate change. And now within this sort of injustice, another emerging issue is the issue of intergenerational injustice. So when we look at how climate change will disproportionately affect different people, obviously today's newborns, today's children, today's adolescents and young people, but also future generations will be forced to bear the greatest consequences of climate change during their lifetimes, despite having contributed the least during their life to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. Because if someone is born today, the data shows that someone born basically in 2020 will be forced to bear between a 2 to 7-fold increase in extreme weather events compared to someone who is born in the 1960s, like, for example, my parents. And so this is the issue of what we call intergenerational injustice, and climate change is really one of the greatest intergenerational injustice of our time. And the last point that I wanted to raise is the issue of the climate crisis being a health crisis. And the World Health Organization is very clear on this. Climate change is one of the greatest threats to human health. And we see that climate change affects human health in different ways, both from a physical perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. And specifically when looking at women, children, and adolescent health, which is what we at PMNCH look at, we know that climate change disproportionately affects women, children, and adolescents' health, specifically in terms of, for example, affecting the health of pregnant women. So during pregnancies, impacting on increase in preterm birth, impacting in terms of increase in maternal and newborn mortality and morbidity, also increasing the risks of gender-based violence. For example, women and girls being forced to walk longer distances, for example, to fetch water or food because of the climate impacts, and therefore being more exposed to gender-based violence. Also, women and girls are more likely to be killed during extreme weather events because often they're not they don't learn the basic survival skills because of the gender discrimination in their societies, in their communities. And so really, when looking at the impacts of climate change on human health, we also have to look at these different vulnerabilities and the existing inequalities that are present in our world.
Julia, I find it really insightful that, climate change is affecting, people's health, but I really appreciate you pushing it further and even elaborating on how it's a form of injustice, intergenerational injustice. That is a really remarkable insight. And in several of your past academic writings and publications, you've described the importance of using a human right-based approach to climate change. I would love if you can please explain what that is, and maybe even share examples of how that's been applied in the current crisis.
Thank you, Toby. And this is actually fundamental. So, the human rights based approach is really founded upon the human rights obligations that states have accepted under international law. And there's two reasons why applying a human rights based approach to climate change is useful. Firstly, it would mandate that climate change policies, financing actions are really responsive and targeted to address the basic human rights of all, but especially the most vulnerable and those who will suffer most from climate change. So it answers the issue of intergenerational injustice, for example, and all the other injustices that are linked to climate change, such as gender injustice, etc. And secondly, the importance of the human rights-based approach is that it indicates some operational principles that policymakers should really follow when designing and implementing such climate-related policies, including during climate negotiations at the international level, at the national level, but also at the local level. Now, when we look at these operational principles, and there's four, in the article that I collaborated with other youth leaders in this space and also academics, what we've looked at is to see how these operational principles, which, as I said, are four: participation, equality and non-discrimination, accountability and transparency. And we've actually analyzed how young people, through their engagement in climate activism, have actually pioneered and helped to really bring forward these operational principles in the application in terms of climate change. So in their climate activism and in their application in terms of climate policies and financing. And I can give some examples. So when we look at, I can go through all the four principles. So if we start by participation, we really see that young people have really led efforts in the past decade, I would say, even more in the past decade, in terms of advocating to ensure that there is a deliberate and meaningful engagement in the global climate change dialogue and in the international negotiations of young people, but also more generally of all those who are most affected by climate change. And this can be seen in various ways. There are many youth movements, starting from the Fridays for Future movement, that have really called for the engagement of young people in these spaces and for young people to have a voice in the climate change decision making. Another example is Youngo, the UNFCCC children and youth constituency, which has been vocal for several years now in terms of really ensuring that young people can participate in these processes. Now, the second principle, equality and non-discrimination, when we look at young people's advocacy in this space, we can really see that young people have been calling for policymakers to address this issue of intergenerational injustice. So, looking at how climate change addresses the needs of current and future generations, and to ensure that their climate policies and targets really take into consideration future generations who will be most impacted. And therefore, we see that their calls are calls for climate justice and call for equality and non-discrimination. At the same time, there's a lot of young people as well that are looking at the intersectionality between, for example, climate change and other issues in terms of discrimination, for example, racial discrimination and environmental racism, which deals with the silencing of marginalized people and activists of color. And young people have been really vocal against this. And a clear example is Vanessa Nakate, the youth activist from Uganda, who is a founder of the Rise Up movement, and who founded this movement really to give voice to African climate activists who have been systematically silenced by media, both in international settings, and have been primarily addressed as victims of climate change rather than agents of change. And Nakate, through her advocacy, and she's also experienced this discrimination herself in 2020 during the Davos World Economic Forum, and has been very vocal about this and about the need to address climate change from an intersectional perspective, looking at the intersection between climate change and existing inequalities, existing discrimination. The third principle is that of accountability. So holding governments and other stakeholders who are those who are most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions accountable for this. Now, in this case, we see that young people have really stepped their foot in this space in various different ways, both in terms of formal accountability mechanisms and informal accountability mechanisms. What do we mean by this? So let's look first at the informal mechanisms. So I think all of you have seen in the recent years the youth movements, the youth climate movements on the streets, and that is a form of informal accountability. So civil society protests to really raise the awareness and raise the issue to policymakers that they're not having ambitious climate policies and they're not actually following their commitments through and have failed in terms of their pledges. So these movements have been massive climate strikes in the past years, and they have been mainly led by the Fridays for Future movement and other youth-led movements, which have then sort of rallied together also adults, teachers, and other parts of society. Now, when looking instead at the formal accountability mechanisms, here one of the clear examples is looking at climate litigation. So young people filing lawsuits against their governments or against other stakeholders because they haven't adhered to certain climate laws or other pledges that they have made, and therefore have filed lawsuits against their governments. And there's example of youth plaintiffs in many countries: Australia, Canada, Colombia, India, Mexico, Pakistan, South Korea. These are some of the ones that we have analyzed, but there's many, and there's growing numbers around the world of children and youth who have filed these petitions. One example is in Colombia, where 25 children and youth in 2018 filed a lawsuit against the Colombian government for the deforestation in the Colombian Amazon, claiming that the deforestation was causing rising temperatures and therefore threatening their right to life, to food, to health, and water. And the lawsuit was actually ruled in favor of young people, with the Supreme Court then ruling that the Colombian government had failed to limit deforestation, and this was a breach of current and future generations' right to life and other of their fundamental rights. Now, the last principle, transparency. So what do we mean by transparency? We mean that we mean basically disclosing climate information and information about what is going on around the world due to climate change. And young people have really been campaigning for more information, both in terms of transparency, in terms of data, to ensure that the information is publicly available, but also in terms of also making this information accessible to children, adolescents, and young people, because it's very important that this information is transferred also within schools, both at the sort of primary school level, but also high school level, secondary schooling, and also at the university level. And so many young people are campaigning around the world to ensure that climate change is formally part of the education system in all the national school curricula, but also in terms of also at the university level, in terms of all university curricula, no matter what you're studying, that there are courses that link sort of climate change and environmental issues to the issue that and the main topic of study of the course. And so really to ensure that there is education, there is transparency around the impacts of climate change on our planet, on human health, and in general in our societies. So just to recap, basically when we look at these four principles, which are the operational principles of the human rights-based approach, we see how children, adolescents, and young people have really been trying to push these operational principles forward. And by doing so, they're helping to adopt and implement a human rights-based approach to climate change, which ensures that climate change responses are more equitable, are more sort of just, and to ensure that we have climate justice.
Julia, I am so in awe by your examples of youth being involved in this, campaign against climate change, both informally as well as even, at the policy discussions and how they're involving, climate litigations, that is so fascinating to me. Something I want to ask you is, what do you see being as the role of young people in addressing climate change? And for a young person that wants to really be an impactful leader in climate change, what do you think it takes to generate and yield tangible impact in this field?
Thank you, Toby. And that's a very sort of inspiring question. And I think what my advice would be to young people who want to be impactful leaders in the fight against climate change, I think I would give three main sort of suggestions. The first one is work in partnership and collaborate. I think at PMNCH and collaborating with PMNCH for the past 3 years, I've really seen the power of partnership and how really if we work together, we can do more than any of us can do alone. And so my main suggestion would be reach out, collaborate, gain strength, build your network with other young people who are already engaged in this space, because there's so many young people who are really leading this space, who are empowering other young people in terms of what could be the first steps, and really try to collaborate together with other youth-led movements at the local level, at your school level, at your university level, at your community level, at your city level. There's so many groups, and it's very, very impactful to join forces together to be more impactful. And one sort of clear example could also be with the children and young people constituency of the UNFCCC. There's also national chapters called the Local Conference of Youth on Climate Change. And they're more or less widespread all around the world. So they're national chapters. There's also more sort of regional chapters. And that's a good way to start getting involved in terms of trying to influence decision making also at the national level. My second suggestion is try to not lose hope. Like, do not lose hope. Continue fighting, because in this space, working in climate advocacy can be very can cause a lot of anxiety and stress. And I do have to say, personally, there are nights that in which, like your mind continues thinking about what will the future be, seeing friends, family, also yourself being caught in storms or rising temperatures, which then cause family members to be sick because of the extreme heat, especially maybe the elderly or the newborns in your family. And it causes a lot of stress thinking, for example, do I want to have children? Do I want to put children in this world, given how the predictions and the different scenarios are saying that things will only get worse. So my suggestion is, do not lose hope, continue fighting. And the best antidote to this is to, as I mentioned before, try to find a support group and really work with other young people who are already active in the space, and try to power through together to ensure that your advocacy can be more meaningful, and to really transfer that anxiety and that stress into advocacy, because sometimes advocacy can be a good antidote for stress related anxiety caused by climate change. So climate anxiety, ecological anxiety, etc. And the third suggestion that I would have is share your lived experience in your advocacy messages, and specifically be equipped by data and amplify evidence-based advocacy. So to be a powerful leader in this space, do not feel shy to share your own lived experience. How is climate change making you feel? How is it affecting your own life? How is it affecting your health, your mental health, that of your family, that of your friends, of your schoolmates, etc. Share your lived experiences, because these can be very, very powerful messages. The second is, in your advocacy, also be equipped with data, be equipped with evidence. There's a lot of data out there. Make sure that your resources are reliable, and ensure that the data can support your advocacy messages, because there's a lot of data out there in terms of the impacts of climate change on human health, on societies, on livelihoods, on food systems, etc. And it's important that as advocates, one digests that information and uses that data for advocacy messages and really to amplify advocacy and to try to make change. So I think these would be my three main suggestions.
Thank you, Giulia. And it should be evident to anyone that's here listening and watching that, you are a very passionate leader. You know your stuff and you are, very inspiring to us all. The last question I have for you before we adjourn is, you know, why are you doing what you're doing? Why did you choose to do the work that you're doing? Why did you choose leadership?
Thanks, Toby. That's a good question. And to be honest, I don't think I have a single answer. I think every person has a sort of life journey, and sometimes, things happen the way they are. And when you look back, you're like, when did I actually decide this? Or what was the moment in my life that made me decide this? So I don't think I have a sort of a single event or a single story to share, but I think one of the turning points in my life was when I started to be engaged with these youth-led movements that I wasn't exposed to before. So during my university, I was very active in terms of at the university level within different university groups already in the climate change space. For example, I was part of the what my university called the Green Consultants. We were looking at how to ensure that our university could be more sustainable, to reduce its carbon emission, reduce its waste. So I was very active in this, and because this was part of also my study area. So within international relations, I also study sustainability. So it was part of my passion. After university, I then started to discover this world of activism that was way beyond sort of my local university, and specifically through the UNFCCC Children and Youth Constituency, which is an amazing space of over, I think, 10,000 or more young people which are engaging in this space. And this was really a turning point because I saw all of the activities of what they were doing, and I started being engaged and contributing to this advocacy, and it was super empowering. Now, in addition to that, then I started being engaged with PMNCH as part of my work. And at PMNCH, we also have an adolescent youth constituency, which is a super vibrant group, which is working on specifically advancing adolescent well-being and young people's health, in terms of also sexual and reproductive health and rights. And with them, we also started looking at what are the impacts of climate change specifically on young people's health and young people's well-being. And so essentially working with other young people has really inspired me, and to sort of continue pursue this in my career, in my leadership, and it's always extremely insightful and invigorating to work with other young people, and see the change that we can make together. And one of my last sort of messages that I do want to give is, as part of this work, working with young people at PMNCH, we have launched the 1.8 billion Young People for Change campaign, which essentially is looking at, as I said before, towards calling for more commitments, more action for adolescent well-being, including at the policy, at a financing, and at a service level. And it's a youth-led campaign, and it wants to rally both youth but other stakeholders as well, governments, private sector, civil society, healthcare professionals, to commit to this population group. On the 11th and 12th of October, we will have the Global Forum for Adolescents, where everyone can sign up. You just have to look online for 1.8, and then you can find more information online. It will be a massive virtual platform main stage where young people will come together in plenaries, in sessions, looking at what are the different aspects of adolescent well-being. What do we mean by adolescent well-being? There will be a session specifically also looking at climate change that I'm working on with amazing young people. So that will be extremely exciting. And through this Global Forum for Adolescents, there will be commitments announced for adolescent well-being by governments, by civil society and non-state actors. And so it will be an extreme moment of advocacy in the lead up to other moments of advocacy, such as the Summit for the Future in 2024 by the United Nations, where and the idea is really to rally commitments for adolescents and young people, because we are the population that will sort of inherit the world, and future generations after us will be inheriting the world. And so it's very important that there are policies, financing, and services for us. And this is why myself, together with other very, very inspiring young people, are in this space to really make a change and to ensure that governments make decisions that are good and in the interest for us and in the interest for our future. And this obviously means making decisions that are sustainable, that are in line with protecting our planet, that are in line with fighting climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in adherence to what was agreed at the Paris Agreement.
Giulia, you are very inspiring, and it has been a sincere pleasure, sharing this space with you and getting this privilege to learn from you. Thank you so much for your time. And anyone watching, listening, I highly recommend you really register for this upcoming event at PMNCH. Thank you, Giulia.
Thank you so much, Toby. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.